Welcome to the City of York, where we are close to the racecourse in Dringhouses. The word dring deriving from a 12th century term to describe a young man who was given a free tenancy in return for providing duties which were partly military and partly servile, thought to conjure with. We're the guests here of the St Edward the Confessor Church, which is celebrating its 150th anniversary. And on our panel, Sayeeda Warsi, who sits in the Cabinet as co-chairman of the Conservative Party, Harriet Harman, who's Shadow Deputy Prime Minister and Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, Unwin, who's been Director of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation since 2007. The foundation, I quote, seeks to understand the root causes of social problems, to identify ways of overcoming them, and to show how social needs can be met in practice. She says that a concern about the dispossessed is what gets her out of bed in the morning. Peter Hitchens is an author and columnist for the Mail on Sunday, who blogs this week that the majority of our, I quote, intelligentsia will continue to regard him as, I quote again, a fascist for proposing what they regard as unthinkable solutions to the kinds of problems manifested in the crime, violence and looting which have so shaken the nation this week. Our panel. Our first question, please.
Martin Baldock, when it comes to keeping order on our streets, who is in charge, police or politicians?
Harriet Harman.
Well, I think the government is responsible for, and Parliament is responsible for setting the laws, the legal framework, and the government is responsible for ensuring the police have the resources they need. But when it comes to actual police operations, what they do day to day, who they arrest, then that has to be an independent decision operationally for the police, because we have in this country a very strong and proud tradition that the police are independent and they are not directed by government, they're not directed by politicians. And I think it is very worrying that the police do seem to feel that the government have kind of trodden over the wrong side of the line on it and have given the impression that it was the government that was directing operations to ensure order on our streets, when the police have made it absolutely clear that it was they who chose the tactics, who built up the numbers on the nights to finally quell the rioting that was in our streets. And I think that the government should, at this point, when there's still police officers lying injured, when the police are still kicking in doors in order to arrest people and looking at CCTV in order to track people down, at this point, the government should be confining themselves to giving the police 100% support.
So when Sir Hugh Ward, the chairman of ACPA, the Association of Chief Police Officers, said on Newsnight, I quote, "The fact that politicians chose to come back from their holidays is an irrelevance in terms of the tactics that were then developing," he's right.
Well, what he was doing is, I think he was saying that they bitterly resent that they felt that David Cameron was somehow implying that it wasn't until he came back from his holiday that a grip was got on it and that it was sorted out. And I think that they feel that he was trying to imply that he'd sorted the situation out when they know that it was they who had done it, and also that he had somehow implied that he was taking decisions. I was quite surprised when I heard in the House of Commons Theresa May saying that she had agreed to cancel police overtime. I mean, actually, those sorts of things are for chief constables. You know, they do an incredibly important job and they shouldn't be encroached on. And that's one of the reasons why I'm very worried about having elected police commissioners.
Okay, we'll leave that right there. Sayeeda Warsi, the Home Office issued a statement on behalf of the Home Secretary saying that Theresa May, I quote, ordered all special constables should be mobilised, all police leave cancelled. Did she make that order? And if she made that order, was she out of order?
Let me go back to the question that Martin was asking, and I'll address that in the question as well. It is the police's job to set operations, and in this particular situation that we've seen unfold over the last 7 days, it was the police that was leading those operations. And let me also say that those police officers that have had to stand in that front line and take missiles, take aggression, not knowing how the situation was going to be changed, going day after day, night after night, in the front line to protect all of us. We can't, any of us, say thank you enough for what they have done and to respect and reward their bravery.
And will you now answer Martin Baldock's question? It's a very simple question. Who's in charge? Police or politicians?
Yeah, but to suggest that those operations are conducted in a vacuum without politicians being there is wrong. I've been at the COBRA meetings that we've been having over this last week. The acting commissioner for the Metropolitan Police is there. Sir Hugh Orde is there. And the Prime Minister asks questions. He says, do you have the resources for the operations that you want to conduct? Do you need any further resources? Are there any glitches in the system? If you start arresting people today, if that's what you're planning to do we have enough room in the cells? If we start remanding people in custody, do we have the prison spaces? What can we do to help further? That is what the Prime Minister needs to be doing in a COBRA meeting. He needs to be making sure that all the police services, the emergency services, feel completely supported and that they have the political will and support of the government behind them. Let me tell you an example.
Let's not take an example. Let's just deal with the...
It's important to give examples, Jonathan, because I spoke...
We've got a lot of questions to get through. I'm sure you'll have a chance. Just answer this question. Did Theresa May, as the Home Office statement said, order all special constables to be mobilised or not?
If the Home Office statement says that, then that's a statement she issued, so she must have done.
So she ordered that all special constables should be mobilised. I'm quoting the statement. Sir Hugh Orde says, which is the core of the question from Martin Baldock, the Home Secretary has, quotes, no power whatsoever to make such an order.
Look, I don't know what personal conversations took place between Hugh
These
Orde
are two
and
public
Theresa May.
statements. These are two public statements that directly contradict one another.
What I can tell you as to what did happen in COBRA, there was a very real discussion about the number of police officers that were needed on our streets, and there was a very real discussion about making sure that we had every available resource, and that meant having to cancel leave. Now, who said what at what time, and who said it first, and who said it second, I think is deeply petty, and I actually think that both politicians and the police are above this, and what we should be doing at this time is not having these petty fallouts, but actually rising above it and saying the police have done a damn good job and we value them for keeping our streets safe.
So Hugh Orde, being an eminent policeman who reached great distinction in Northern Ireland, might not feel that he was making a petty point. I don't know. But Peter Hitchens.
Well, the simple answer to the question is, of course, when things are going well, the politicians are responsible, and when things are going badly, the police are responsible. Because the politicians have many more spin doctors than the police do. And I noticed, of course, the Baroness Warsi hiding behind the police in her response there, saying, oh, well, let's all identify with the police. The police, well, of course, none of us is going to denigrate police officers who stand out in the street and brave missiles and danger. Who could possibly do that? But what we're actually asking here is about who's in charge and whether they know what they're doing. And it's perfectly plain that they don't. As to who is actually in charge, Roy Jenkins began the process of nationalising the police back under the Harold Wilson government in 1964. He destroyed most of the local police forces, which used to actually be genuinely local. The awful, hideous police college at Bramshill was created, which has put every police force in the country under the control of indoctrinated sociologists. And well, it's true. You look at the chief constables. These are almost invariably people with social science degrees. Is that what you want? Standing up to criminals? Personally, no. But this has been the tendency: the closure of police stations, the withdrawal of police from foot patrol, the political correctness of the police, the general retreat from their doing what we want them to do into being a neutral body which negotiates between offender and victim. And which, let's be quite honest, were quite incapable of coping with this event when it began. Not because of the failings of individual officers or because of a lack of courage, but because they simply didn't know what to do, and they were under the control of people who were fundamentally unprepared for what was going to happen. I could have told them it was going to happen. Most of you could have told them it was going to happen. We've seen the decline of order, morality and authority in this country gathering pace over the past 25 years. This event was inevitable. They weren't ready for it because they simply aren't able to understand what's wrong with the country.
Julia Unwin.
Thank you.
I don't think this is a petty distinction at all. I think one of the fundamental strengths of a free democracy is that we do have a separation between government and the police. And the fact that the police are looked to as a professional body who can make those decisions is what we hold them to account for. I think we ask government to hold them to account and to manage the strategy, but we absolutely require the police to set operational direction. I think what's so unseemly about the debate in the last few days is at this very sad and difficult and troubling time, we're ending up with a fight about who said what about leave. All the governments I've ever known find it incredibly difficult to understand the value and the importance of independence, whether it's the police or any other body, and I think we need to maintain that. We lose it at our peril.
Thank you. Our next question, please.
Geoffrey Whittaker. Should police numbers be reconsidered now in the aftermath of the riots?
There are proposed budgetary cuts of 20% over the next 4 years, which is what you're referring to, should this be reconsidered.
Correct. I mean, when we looked at the riots starting, they were woefully undermanned, which caused a lot of the problems. And the movement from police force to police force creates shortages in other areas of the country that would allow the riots then to start in different areas. And how do you react if there's 2 or 3 riots all at the same time?
Should this be reconsidered, Peter Hitchens?
I don't think it's the issue. I think if you look at the numbers of police in this country, we have now, both per head of population and as an absolute number, more police officers than we ever had before. What the problem is what they do. And so many of them are constrained by ridiculous pieces of legislation like the Police and Criminal Evidence Act 1984 and its codes of practice, and the human rights laws which also restrict them. So, for instance, if a police officer arrests somebody on the street, he's committed to 5 hours minimum of bureaucracy and paperwork, so he don't do so. The police have been emasculated by regulation and law and human rights, so that it doesn't matter how many of them you have, they won't be able to do the job you want them to do. What's really necessary is the repeal of these foolish laws and the replacement of this reactive police force, which sits in remote buildings. Most of the police stations have been closed as well. Sits in remote buildings far away, waits for things to go wrong, and then reacts. The replacement of that with what we actually want, what everybody wants, which is quite practical, and which would actually be cheaper, which is a police force patrolling on foot, preventing the outbreak of trouble in the first place. No more effective form of policing has ever been devised than that. It worked when we had it. The reasons for getting rid of it were in fact non-existent, and it would be very, very easy and very, very simple to reinstate it with a very small amount of legislation, which neither the Conservative Party nor the Labour Party will even contemplate, because they're wholly hostage to the politically correct, basically anti-police ideas which fostered that legislation in the first place. You'll get nothing from them. I promise you, nothing.
Julie Unwin.
I've no idea whether these cuts are safe ones to make or not. What I do know is this is a very bad week for making these sorts of decisions. And I think if we make a decision about these cuts and reinstating them or not at a time of crisis and panic, we will almost certainly make the wrong decision. We need to step back and think very carefully about the deployment of the police, the task we're asking them to do. On that, I strongly agree with Peter. I think we have to be really clear about what the job is and where else help comes for these communities. What troubles me is that if we reinstate these numbers, and I can see lots of tempting reasons to do it, and my guess is it will happen, we will have to find that money elsewhere. And if we take that money out for other places, if we take it out from youth service, if we take it out from where young people are entertained and diverted and given access to work, then we're shoring up more trouble for ourselves. So I want to urge the government to have a long, slow think about this. It may well be that a 20% cut is entirely inappropriate. And I agree with the questioner. It looks like that on the surface. But these were extraordinary times. They're not times we've seen that often in our history. And I think we need to take stock and think about it more carefully.
Under the proposed cuts, according to Her Majesty's Inspectorate Police, frontline numbers in 42 out of the 43 forces in England and Wales would fall by 2% by the year 2012. The Labour Party wants it totally reverse these cuts, Harriet Harman?
Well, we did think, and we did say that we thought, along with across the different public services, we had to look at ensuring that that the police were trying to be more efficient and that they would have to have some cuts in their budget. But what we took very carefully into account is what Her Majesty Inspectorate of Constabulary said. And what they said is that if you go beyond 12% cuts to the police, you cannot but affect frontline services. And we took that very seriously indeed, because over the years that we were in government, we built up the numbers of police, and actually that provided reassurance and gave people more confidence to see them out on the street. And it also played its part in cutting crime. And so we saw the number of police going up and we saw crime going down. And I've always opposed, even before the riots, opposed the idea that there should be a 20% cut in the police. 16,000 fewer police officers. And I also think it's just downright rude to the police to say, as sometimes the Conservatives have been saying, oh, we can cut 16,000 police, and because they're all wasting their time, you won't notice the difference. They aren't wasting their time. Even if they're not on the street, some of them are doing very detailed investigative work, like the sort of investigative work which gets to the heart of unpicking and discovering the gangs that were at the part of the riots. Just because you can't see them on the street doesn't mean they aren't doing good work. And cutting 20% of the police, even before the riots, it was madness. Afterwards, surely even the government should recognise it.
Sayeeda Warsi.
The police are not sat around wasting their time. They don't want to sit around wasting their time. But under the last government, they were made to sit around to waste their time. They were chasing targets. Let me tell you what targets they were chasing. The policing pledge, the confidence targets, the PSA targets, and they were spending hundreds of thousands of hours on paperwork. They were spending at any one time, only 11% of our police officers were actually out on patrol. And any individual officer was spending 22% of their time on filling in forms and 14% of their time on actually patrolling the streets.
It should be pointed out here that much of that paperwork originated under the last Conservative government.
And we think... And this government believes that the police should be chasing one single target, and that's about cutting crime. Now, this week, sadly, opportunistically, and at such a difficult time for the country, the Labour Party has been making much of police numbers. And I think I should quote back to you.
To be honest, we had been saying it before.
Harriet, I should actually quote back to you what your late leader, Ed Miliband, said less than 6 months ago. We could have cut £1 billion from the policing budget, which would have been a 12% cut in the policing budget. Here in North Yorkshire, where the budget will be cut from 147 million to 144 million over 4 years, that's 3.5 million. That's an 11% cut. So actually here, they're better off than they would have been under you. And Ben Bradshaw, your colleague, said...
Hang on, let's not go down the quoting route, because too much of the time... Well, can we cut to the... There are a lot of things to discuss,
yes.
And I say this not only to you, Sayeeda, but to the whole panel.
Can I just say...
No, you can't say anything for a moment, because I'm exerting chairman's rights, I'm afraid. You will be able to say something. Let me put this question, the same question I put to Harriet Harman to you, which is at the heart of Geoffrey Whitaker's question. If Her Majesty's Inspectorate says that police frontline numbers will be reduced by 2% by 2012, is that something that you are prepared to accept against this new context, which is what the Prime Minister seems to be saying?
If you look at the context that we're speaking in now, we had sufficient police officers to deal with the situation we found in our streets. If, God forbid, and I hope it never happens again, if this situation was to happen again, despite the spending restraints, we would have the police numbers to be able to keep us safe. That has been said by the Prime Minister, it's been said by the Home Secretary. There is a huge amount of savings that can be made.
The police don't seem to think the same way, do they?
Whether it's national procurement, IT equipment, cutting back bureaucracy, a whole series of measures can be taken out, and the police are crying out to be freed up to get out and do what they set out to do, which is to police our streets, not to fill in forms.
I'm sorry to persist with this, but you said they will have enough. You're saying there will be enough, even if there are less frontline officers as a result of these cuts.
The Home Secretary has said over and over again that despite the change in spending budgets of the police, there should not be an impact on frontline visible policing. It couldn't be any clearer than that.
What she's saying, but the official body is saying that this will happen. Sir Hugh Ord again says it will inevitably mean fewer police officers.
The chief constable, I mean, you don't like quotes, but there are police officers, chief constables after chief constable who have come out and said, despite the spending restraints, they do not feel, I mean, the chief constable of Greater Manchester said that we have an obsession with the number of police officers, which meant that we've kept them artificially high. And he said himself, we have had lots of police officers doing admin posts just to hit numbers. What we need them is to stop doing admin work. We need them to be out keeping our streets safe.
I think the idea that you can lose 16,000 police officers and not notice the difference on the front line is absolutely ludicrous. And also, Sayeeda, I would say that we said, when you announced the 20% cut in October, we said this is the wrong thing to do. I mean, we've said anyway the deficit reduction is too fast, but on this, we've said it's the wrong thing to do. And I really do not think we should be told that because there's been a riot, we should stop saying we oppose the cuts in police numbers, and I should be accused of opportunism for saying something again that I've been saying since October. And I don't think that that's kind of fair politics to accuse us of opportunism for being consistent. And I'm against the police numbers cuts, I'm against the EMA
Harriet.
cuts,
You haven't
I'm
been
against
consistent.
youth unemployment rising, and I'm going to carry on saying that.
Peter Hitchens.
The sterility of this discussion is amazing. If Harriet Harman were in government, she would be saying exactly what Sayeeda Warsi is saying. If Sayeeda Warsi were in opposition, she'd be saying exactly what Harriet Harman is saying.
In that case, we will...
True or false, neither of them has anything interesting to say about how the country is policed. That is the crucial question which we have in front of us, which they will not address. It is how the country is policed, the way we want it done or the way the London Liberal elite want it done. Until that is addressed, which these elite parties will not touch, you will not hear any sense anywhere at all. That is the question. How are we to be policed?
We could continue with that precise issue. If you have thoughts about that, any answers programme after the Saturday broadcast of any questions may be for you. The number to ring is 03 700 100 444 and the email address is any.answers@bbc.co.uk. Our next, please.
Margaret Centamore. Is there an underlying moral deficit in our society today which led to the looting and public disorder we witnessed this week?
I'm sorry, before coming to the key question, this is York and your name is Sentamu. Does that suggest a relationship with any prominent individual?
I'm not sure whether that is a fair question to ask,
But given that it's unfair, are you spouse or in other way related to the Archbishop?
I am connected. Yes, I am.
Thank you. You're like a politician, so slow to answer the question. Julia Unwin on this first. Julia?
We've been swimming in a sea, haven't we, of people talking about the moral malaise that we're facing. And there's clearly something very wrong when young people behave in the way they did. Something terrible has happened, and has happened over a very long period of time. I think, however, to say that there's one simple cause is to mistake what's happened. I think we have to understand the detail, and we have to really take stock and focus on what's happened. Yes, there's clearly evidence that some young people are not well parented. They're not looked after and raised in a way that means they know how to behave. That is a major problem. Clearly there's a problem about a number of people feeling they have no hope, they have nothing left to lose. And clearly there's a sense of greed and entitlement which affected some of those people. The causes of these sorts of events are always very complicated, and those of us who rush to judgment will often make mistakes. I think we have to understand that something very difficult is happening to that generation that have been scarred by unemployment and feel very little hope for the future, none of which justifies the appalling behaviour that's taken place. Whether we call it a moral malaise, or an issue of individual pathology, or a question of how society is structured, seems to me to be almost a deliberate distraction. What really matters is what the solutions are that give those people some hope and some reason never, ever to behave like that again.
we may, this is unusual any questions because normally we do a variety of questions, a variety of topics. Because of the magnitude of this issue, we're discussing a whole range of related issues on this one subject. And we will come, I hope, pretty soon to the question of what to do. But the diagnosis is obviously interesting and important, as you've just identified. Harriet Harman.
Well, I think at the heart of these terrible riots, and I think it's impossible to overstate the real terror that they instilled in people. People never expected to see a complete breakdown of law and order on their streets. And although order has been restored to our streets, normality hasn't, because people are still absolutely in shock. And I think at the very heart of it, there was some gang action, and that has been something which has been developing. And in the heart of those gangs, there is a moral deficit. People who have no sense of right and wrong and who are prepared to completely exploit other people that they get involved in the gangs. And that is something that the police, I know, in London and elsewhere had really been working on, working with the local communities to try to get to the bottom of how to deal with it. But there was also a whole load of other people around who got swept up into it, who I wouldn't say necessarily, despite the fact that they've committed and been party to terrible criminal offences, I wouldn't say they're part of a general moral malaise. I would agree with Julia that families are very important and bring young people up to know right and wrong. But one of the paradoxes is, and I've been to sit with mothers who've lost their children who've been involved in gang crime, and sometimes I've gone to a completely dysfunctional household where everything is chaotic and all the kids are in trouble and there's no sense of order or decent upbringing. Sometimes I've gone to a family where there's a mother and a father with a lovely home and the parents working and knowing right from wrong, with, you know, a lovely brother and a sister, and then one child that's got involved in gang crime. So you can have bad families actually and good children finding their way through, and you can have good families finding they've got bad children. So I agree with Julia, it is very complicated indeed. But I do think it's also important that not only do young people stay on the straight and narrow because they've got good parenting, and we should support parents in bringing up their children, but they do need to have, and this is a point that David Lammy, the MP for Tottenham, made very much. He said he was brought up by a lone parent with very little money on a very difficult estate. He sometimes felt very frustrated and felt the temptation to go off the rails. And it wasn't just his brother and his teachers that kept him on the rails. It was the hope that he might be able to make something of his life, that he might be able to go to university and really make something of his life. And I think that we underestimate at our peril the importance not just of family structure, but hope for the future for our young people. They all deserve that.
Harriet Harman, in this context, why did you feel it important to bring up the issue of cuts, government spending cuts? You said on Newsnight, making it clear that there was no excuse for what happened. You went on to say, there's a sense that young people feel they're not being listened to. But when you've got the trebling of tuition fees, they should think again about that. When you've got the EMA, Educational Maintenance Allowance, being taken away, when you've got jobs being lost and youth unemployment rising and they're shutting the jobs centre in Camberwell, well, you should think again. Why did you bring that in?
Well, because I've always thought that the Educational Maintenance Allowance, which we brought in to help encourage young people to stay on at school, was important. I think that actually cutting the university budgets and forcing them to treble their tuition fees to 9,000 is a bad thing. And we'd actually doubled the number of young people in Camberwell and Peckham, for example, who'd gone to university. That was giving people more hope.
So there is a relationship between what happened, a relationship, although you don't approve of it, and, in your view, the cuts that the government is initiating, although in the case of the Educational Maintenance Allowance and the university tuition fees, they haven't yet come in.
I think that at the heart of this is a problem of gang activity, as I've said. But I think the way to stop other people being swept in is to have good activities for kids and good hope for the future for kids. That's not to justify it, that's not to excuse it, but we've got to think very hard about how we give people such a stake in society that they wouldn't dream of taking a sort of mad action, a terrible action of kicking in a window and stealing a television. So, I mean, I'm consistently for more opportunities for young people. I think they're entitled to that, and I think that that's really important.
And there is therefore an important underlying linkage between that kind of horror on the streets and the cuts that are associated with deprivation.
Well, when I said to my constituents, and I was, down in the immediate aftermath of the riot, and also just this morning down in Rye Lane, where incidentally half of Rye Lane is still boarded up because there's a building that's tumbling down. I actually asked people on the street, the good, hard-working people of Peckham, who are the law-abiding members of that community, I said to them, why has this happened? What do you think's happened? And they know more about it than I do or anybody else on this panel. They are the people of that community who have got their neighbours and friends on those estates. And they said that actually the sense that there is less of a future now for young people is important. So, Peter, no doubt, and Sayeeda can say this is a terrible thing for me to say, but I'm speaking up for what they think, and they think that fewer opportunities underlines the sense that allows people to become victims of being drawn into gang activity. There is policing that needs to be done to pick apart these gangs and to put the leaders in prison, but there is also public policy issues of really giving hope for the future.
Peter Hitchens.
Well, I think there's, first of all, something rather sneaky about what Harriet is saying, and secondly, something ridiculous. I'm not going to get angry about it because it's futile getting angry with people like this. They don't respond to it. But if you seriously want to maintain that people are going to go and kick in the window of a television shop and steal a plasma screen because they're worried about their future, in the end, that's your problem. If you honestly want to stand up in public and maintain that there can be any connection between the two, I don't know how it is that anyone who says that can survive in public life, because it just seems to me to be so laughably, comically absurd that it defies belief. So there are actually people in this audience who think that if they felt that their future was threatened, they'd go and smash in a shop window and steal a plasma TV screen. Why is it always the TV shops that these people feel the need to kick in when their futures are so threatened? It is beyond belief that a person could come into public life and say that. And I think that there should be a sort of almost a moment of silence, of sorrow, that the level of our political debate should have been reduced so low. The problem is plainly a moral one. The problem is plainly that we have, over the past 50 years, destroyed the moral foundation of this society. We've destroyed the married family. We've destroyed particularly fatherhood, and most especially fatherhood. Well, I'll tell you who has. Successive governments. By making it easier to break up a marriage than to end a car leasing agreement, by encouraging and subsidising one-parent families in which there are no fathers, which, for all that there may well be single mothers who do a terrific job, as we're all obliged to say, or we'll be taken off and lynched, for all that there are such mothers, it is statistically the case.
When you say you'll be taken off and lynched,
I just finish a sentence, then interrupt me. It is
I will interrupt you as much as I like, actually, because you deserve interrupting from time to time.
That the outcomes for the children of such households are dramatically worse than for the outcomes of children of married families.
Let me ask you
now
this.
You can interrupt.
I will interrupt on my terms, not your terms,
yeah,
okay?
I know, but I just feel that I do get interrupted slightly more than other people.
It's because you sometimes go on longer than some others, but that's by the by. You said that people would get lynched. You meant it metaphorically. If you said that single mothers, there are also single fathers, of course, do a great job. But you're not saying that you don't think that a great many single mothers do a great job?
No, it's no doubt there are some that do. But the point is that if as a country you specifically set out to subsidise. You specifically set out to subsidise a form of household in which there is no father, then do not be surprised if you have large numbers of boys growing up who lack authority and direction and example in their lives, and who go on the streets and kick in the windows of television shops in later life. It is something which is likely to happen. If you simultaneously take away the authority of teachers in schools, if you simultaneously take away the rights of police officers to act individually on the streets against wrongdoing, if you take away in general the rights of adults to control children, you will get what we have got. And if also at the same time you dismantle the Christian religion so that it's no longer taught or espoused by authority, you will get a serious moral deficit. Morality is what people do when they think nobody is looking. Those people on those nights behaved as if they thought nobody was looking, as they wished to do. That is what you will get. And it is impossible to separate these issues.
Thank you. Sayeeda Warsi.
The question we have to ask ourselves is, what is the thing that united a university student, a teacher, a care worker, a millionaire's daughter, somebody with a job, somebody without a job, people who were 48, people who were 18, people who were 11? What was it that actually, the underlying force that united all of these people to go out, loot, burn down houses, burn down buildings, attack police officers, kill people's livelihoods, kill people? What united them all? It was a single concept of morality where people were no longer prepared to make the distinction between right and wrong. That's what it came down to. The fact that as a society, the fact that as a society over time we have become so dumbed down, we have become so indifferent, we're prepared to turn away, look the other way and walk past and not say, if you do something wrong, if you step over the line, if you go out and burn down somebody's house and make them homeless, if you take away the livelihood of somebody who's worked all their life to build it, if you go out and end up killing people who are trying to defend their communities, then you will suffer the consequences of your actions, whatever that may be. And I think
Who said they shouldn't suffer the consequences of their actions? Nobody said you can burn down a house and not suffer the consequences of your actions.
To try and wrap that all up in a whole series of things. I came from a very difficult background. I grew up in a working class environment where money was short. I grew up in an environment where actually racism was still quite widespread and there were barriers placed in my way. But I tell you what I thought. I knew that if I got into trouble, my parents wouldn't tolerate it when I got home, so I was worried more about my parents than I was about what the police would do. But I also knew that the way to work my way out of that was to go to college, was to get a decent education, to work hard at every job that was given to me. I didn't think I needed to break into Foot Locker and pinch some brand new trainers.
I'm going to go back to our questioner, Margaret St. Tamu.
I agree with some of the comments around the table. I think we've lost that kind of moral framework and boundary, which, whether you're a person of faith or no faith, but coming from a Christian perspective, we've lost that Judeo-Christian background, which provided a framework, and I'm sure people of other faiths would, and probably people with no faith would. And once you do that, then it becomes a sort of perilous slope, as it were. We no longer we're overly focused on our own individual needs rather than the needs of the community. So it is a very complex question, and I think all institutions need to really seriously consider, where are we going to go from here? We need to work together, because not one single person is to blame.
Thank you. And a quick word on that from Julia Unwin from...
I think the world is much more complicated than several people on this panel have said. There was no single unifying force. Those people who were rioting and breaking the law and doing those terrible things were doing it because an opportunity arose. And I'm with Margaret. I think there is a real moral issue here, but I think it's a very broad one, and I think there are all sorts of different factors that caused it. I think if we lose sight of that, we simplify the position people are in, and then we will never develop a solution.
But let's Let's not lose sight of, for every one young person who was involved in the riot, there were hundreds that were involved in the clean-up campaign and that actually are decent, hard-working young people.
I'm sure you will have thoughts about this and the other matters that we're talking about. The Any Answers number, once again, for you is 03 700 100 444, and the email address is any.answers@bbc.co.uk. Swiftly, please, to our next.
Linda Maynard. Should parents of children taking part in the riots be evicted by councils from social housing?
This possibility was one of those mooted by the Prime Minister, and in fact, Wandsworth Council has taken the first steps to evict a tenant, and I think I'm right, whose son was convicted of a crime in the riots. Should this happen? Peter Hitchens?
No. First of all, it's completely against the principles of English law to punish somebody for the actions of somebody else. Secondly, the idea, which still seems to exist in the minds of some politicians, that there are such things as parents in these places is false. These people are not parents. They are adults living in the same house, but they have no authority. The social reforms of the past 40 years, particularly the Children Act, but many others, have stripped parents of any authority over their children to such an extent that if they try to exercise it, they can often get into quite severe trouble. And I really do not think that it is fair to say to parents, first of all, you must not exercise authority over your children, and then to throw you out of your house because your children have misbehaved. It's a gimmick, it's a stunt. It's the kind of thing which governments of the kind that we have, and governments of the kind that we had a couple of years ago, will reach for when they're in trouble, to make themselves look tough, when in reality they're neither tough nor prepared to face the reality of the situation. I think it's a silly, gimmicky proposal, and it should be rejected.
A silly, gimmicky proposal. Baroness Warsi? It's actually happening, at least in one case.
Yeah, when you're a social tenant, you have to sign up a contract, which basically says that you and your family must abide by the conditions of that contract. And one of those conditions is that you don't go around causing criminal damage in the local area, and you don't go around terrorising people in the local area. I think it's a very basic condition, which all of us abide by in the homes and the communities in which we live. If you break those conditions, then the consequences are that you lose your housing. That is what the contract says. What the government is consulting on, at the moment, the law only allows you to evict somebody if they terrorise their local community and cause criminal damage in their local community. But if a young person from York decides not to terrorise and do criminal damage in York, but decides to go to Leeds to do it, you can't evict them because it wasn't in their local area. I don't think that's right, and therefore the government is saying that we need to consult, that it should be the behaviour, not where you do that behaviour, that should determine whether or not that contract is broken. Now, a lot has been made of this to say, well, you're going to throw poor people out on the street, people who are on subsidised housing, and you're punishing people twice. But if you go ask the people who were privately renting some of those homes that were burnt, and who are now in temporary accommodation with their kids because these people burnt their houses down, or if you go ask some of those people who had businesses, whose businesses have now collapsed because they were burnt and therefore they can't afford to pay their mortgage, or if you go ask the looter who had a job and is now going to get a custodial sentence and therefore is going to lose their job and possibly lose their house and their mortgage, what that is saying is, if you take part in criminal activity, you will suffer the consequences of those actions, and if that means losing your home, poor or rich, you had it coming.
Thank you. And Harriet Harman.
Well, I think first and foremost, the punishment for the terrible crimes that have been committed has to be meted out by the courts. And I think it's very important work that's going on now with arresting and with the prosecutors and going through the courts. And I hope and I'm sure that the courts will recognise that they will need to pass sentences which make people think that not only will they be caught, but when they are caught, that they will receive a very severe punishment. And I think that's the job of the criminal courts, to punish people for criminal offences. Now, there is, as Sayeeda has said, provision that councils can evict people, or at least they can go to the courts and ask for an eviction order, so it's a matter for the courts, if they've been creating a menace in their area, like if they've been running a crack den from a council place, or they've been terrorising their neighbours. So there's already that provision in the law to go to courts, and I know that if people have been a menace in the area where they live, and that's what some councils, including my own council now, are thinking that they will probably be doing in relation to those who've been rioting and creating mayhem in their own areas. But it's for the courts to decide, because they have to look at each and every circumstance.
And Julia Unwin?
I'm delighted to say I completely agree with Peter Hitchens on this. This is It's not a penalty that will work. It's wrong in ethical terms, it's wrong in legal terms, and it's absolutely wrong in practice to evict people from their homes for something that one member of the family has done.
And we can squeeze in one more.
Susan Collier. In a week of disheartening news at home and abroad, what has given you most hope?
Very brief answers, I'm afraid, really just a sentence or so. Sayeeda Warsi.
Tariq Jahan, the father whose family I spoke to earlier this week, who, having lost the dearest thing that most of us have in our lives, which is our children, said, don't lose your sons too. Use this moment of sadness as a way of bringing the communities together. He showed the ultimate...
Only a phrase, Peter, I'm afraid. Only a phrase, I'm afraid.
Well, and it's easy, nothing.
Julia?
I hope Tariq Jahan is knighted for what he did for Britain this week. I think he did an extraordinary thing.
And Harriet?
I totally agree with this on Sayeeda and the way she expressed it, and Julia, so totally agree.
At which point we come to the end of this week's